In today's podcast, we're going to be talking about anti-tank guns. Now, anti-tank guns are an interesting defensive tool that the player gets access to relatively quickly. These come out with the basic Tier 1 basic tech high velocity guns. And I'm just going to read you the manual entry, which comes in at page 321. If bazookas are not cutting it anymore against enemy armour, consider producing AT guns. These can use the newest tech in high velocity guns and pack as much punch as armour. They perform best in a defensive role. This says it all. AT guns are a static defensive unit that are used to take on hard targets such as tanks, buggies, APCs, that kind of thing. They have a similar role, I'd say, to tank destroyers, and you can also use medium tanks and heavy tanks, and to a lesser extent light tanks, in a similar role when they're used defensively. Now, AT guns do have a big advantage over the other types, and that advantage comes when you're using them in terrain. For example, if you have got your tanks parked in high mountains, we're going to use an extreme example here. Tanks will receive a negative 50% defense modifier, and guns do not. Any kind of gun, so that's artillery and AT. So anti-tank guns are particularly effective in terrain where normal tanks are just going to be not so good, okay? You're going to get a big defensive penalty. I'd say that the main issue with anti-tank guns on their own is that they are relatively immobile. They also get a big penalty to their attack value because they're a static thing. They're not really supposed to be used in assaults necessarily. You can use them like that, and they're, especially with the high caliber guns, they can be very, very effective, in supporting, say, an infantry attack when you're attacking APCs alongside that are supporting enemy infantry or tanks. However, they're not best used in that position. You really want to be using armor for that particular job. So AT guns can actually get a very high caliber of high velocity gun. They can get right up to 300 millimeters, at least as far as I've seen. And anybody out there, if you've seen higher and it can go higher, let me know. I'm one of those players who tends to finish the game before it gets to the end game, usually to the very, very end game. So it's possible that I've missed some stuff. Now, the anti-tank gun cannot be upgraded with laser, beam, or plasma, as far as I know. That's something that I've not seen, and I assume that that's the case. However, a 300mm caliber HVG on an anti-tank gun is going to have 1200 firepower, which is 200 firepower more than a medium laser. And that's 300 less than a large laser that you would get on a heavy tank or, a monitor tank or a tank destroyer. So these caliber guns are pretty high, okay? That is going to do a lot of damage, and you don't necessarily need lasers on them, I don't think. I think that AT guns are particularly useful if you attach them to, if they've got a propulsion method, like a motorized element or mechanized element. This makes them a lot quicker. And if you actually add the anti-tank gun using the custom formations type to another formation, such as an independent infantry battalion, something like this, then actually the ability to have the motorized or mechanized element will enable it to keep up with any other motorized or mechanized troops. So they're not actually as immobile as they might initially seem. You have plenty of options for deploying these things. I think the question with these guys is then, when do you use anti-tank guns, and when would you actually use a medium tank, say, if that's the kind of technology level that you're at, or later in the game, would you use a tank destroyer? How do they compare to tanks defensively? Well, we've talked about the defensive modifiers. So guns don't get any terrain modifiers as far as I can remember. They are useful everywhere in defense. Now, they do get attack penalties if they are used on the attack in terrain. So, for example, in the high mountains that I was talking about earlier, AT guns and artillery will get a negative 50% combat modifier on top of their already significant attack penalty. So they are really, really poor for attacking in that kind of terrain. They are, I think, strictly a defensive weapon, really. That's how they need to be seen. But they are much, much, much more effective than tanks of any kind in their stated role as a defensive weapon. So anti-tank guns seem to lend themselves to situations where you're expecting attack by armoured forces, whether that'll be medium tanks, any of the tank models, or walkers. And you're kind of able to preempt this. They are also useful if you've got them attached to motorised or mechanised troops, because you can attach them to other battalions, or you can bring them up, in those motorised elements to quickly plug a gap to reinforce a line of, say, infantry that are suddenly under attack by mechanised elements. So they are very, very effective plugging gaps in your line, essentially. So you might have a vital choke point, and if you load that up with anti-tank guns and, some anti-air stuff, that can be really, really difficult for an opponent to get past, at least until in games where air forces aren't around. That's not going to be a problem, but with air forces, they can take out anti-tank guns pretty easily. So they need protecting from the air, but otherwise they are very, very hard to beat there. So I think it's also important to state that anti-tank guns are actually quite expensive to make. And I think this has been one of the things that has perhaps put some players off using them more often. They're kind of as expensive to build as tanks, especially when you start getting into those much higher caliber guns on them. They are a similar industrial point and metal cost as you would pay for a tank of the same kind of size, if I remember right. Correct me if I'm wrong there, by the way, but it's something along those lines, which can make them seem like an unattractive option. Tanks can attack, and tanks are fast, and you don't need the mechanised element on top of a tank because it's already motorised, it's already got the wheels. So tanks are much more versatile, but in that one specific role that anti-tank guns are designed to fulfill, tanks just don't compare to them really, unless they're sat in open terrain. Now, you might want to consider that anti-tank guns might seem a lot less effective or desirable than a tank if you're only using them in open terrain. However, they also stack very, very well with the defensive modifiers that infantry get when they're in terrain. So these things are all about utilising the terrain around you, along with infantry elements and things like artillery, other kind of guns that also, work well in tough terrain. So I think if you're playing on a map where you've got plenty of open terrain, anti-tank guns are probably a little bit less effective. It's likely that you're going to want to go with tanks, particularly things like tank destroyers. When tank destroyers come out, they are a very, very cost-effective way of defending your territory in a mobile way. Tank destroyers are also cheaper than heavy tanks as well. But they have the same kind of hit points. They don't have the cupola, so they're a lot cheaper to build, but they don't work so well in attack, which is something we were discussing when we were talking about medium tanks. Tank destroyers have got a really, really big attack penalty when it comes to their hard attack, but it's not as big, I don't think, as AT guns with the way the various design role modifiers work out. So I'm going to turn this over to you guys. Do you like anti-tank guns? And if so, where is it that you are using them? Do you find that they are better in terrain, which is my experience? The statistics certainly seem to support this, right? They are useful in terrain if you're defending like mountains or forests, and you've got tanks trying to, kind of push their way through those kind of areas. You have anti-tank guns in there, then that's going to be pretty effective, right? Or are you finding that they're also pretty useful if you're bringing them along in kind of open areas, and perhaps you're using them alongside motorized trucks or mechanized elements, and bringing them to support a sort of more mobile blitzkrieg kind of tactic line? Or do you think they just suck and you never use them? And if that's the case, let us know why. We want to know what is the problem with these tools if they're not performing in the way that you want them to. Is it that you've just not really thought about them because there are better tools that seem to be available? Let me know in the comments, guys. And by the way, thank you for everybody who's been commenting so far. This has been really, really successful so far. I'm really, really pleased with the amount of people that have been, joining in and just kind of getting a community discussion going on these topics. This is the main reason why I wanted to do this, because I think that it's really, really good to get everybody else's opinion. I still consider myself to be a beginner at this game. I've been playing for 1,000 or more hours. Like, it's got to be more than that. I think that one series that I did was many, many hundreds of hours. So but I still consider myself to be a beginner because this is such a big and deep game. And the more people we've got discussing this and kind of contributing to, to the table of ideas, the better. And also, for those of you who missed it, actually Vic is listening to these. So hi Vic, and thank you for listening. This is an opportunity for the community to have their say and tell us what you think about these various things. I've so far been focusing on various models, but I'm going to start switching it up and talking about different elements of the game, because Shadow Empire is a big, big game, and it's not just about the combat, it's not just about the individual units. Although I think it's been interesting to start with that light tank discussion and just see where that goes. So I might do a few more episodes on the models. Okay, guys, let me know what you think in the comments. Get involved with the discussion. Share this in any Discord groups that you have, or on various social media, because it'll be great if we can get as many people contributing it towards it as possible. And then like Vic said, particularly he's finding it interesting because he's getting some feedback on the game, and I think that's really, really helpful and healthy for the state of the game in general. And we know that changes can be made to Shadow Empire, and changes have been made. For example, anti-tank guns until recently were seeming to be underperforming, and Vic actually made a change with them relatively recently where he increased their effectiveness against hard targets, essentially giving them more hit points, I think it was. So yeah, have your say, and let's get this conversation going. Okay guys, take care.